How is it going, everybody? I'm Sam Lee, reading for writer Leonid Melikhov, and welcome to Gaming Instinct's review of Biomutant. Biomutant represents a bizarre blend of influences that, if not for a range of production issues, may have actually come together in a compelling fashion. It comes across as an attempt to merge Mass Effect with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, albeit one that is compromised by the limits of time, budget, and a lack of development experience. The resulting mess, though indisputably ambitious, makes for a game that feels untested and is hard to recommend. The game takes place in what seems to be a post-apocalypse universe that somewhat resembles Earth, with furry-type mutated creatures inhabiting the world. The game's story is super basic, and after about an hour or so of gameplay, you are put in the open world of Biomutant. In a nutshell, you play a furry creature that goes through a series of basic tasks and personal memories that act as tutorials to learn the fundamentals of the game's mechanics such as combat, traversal, etc. Later on, you find out what has happened to the world and how it became polluted with toxicity, mutants, who's responsible for it, and what you have to do in order to save it. If you're looking for a groundbreaking and deeply emotional storytelling, then you must look elsewhere, because you won't find it here. The plot is extremely simple and only really exists for the sole reason of having an excuse to explore the game's world. While Biomutant's world may seem interesting at its first sight, as you continue throughout your journey you start to realize that it's extremely bland, reused, and just poorly designed. Once you start the game, you're instantly thrown into the character creator just like any other RPG. In the character creator, players can pick primary and secondary fur colors for their little cute or not so cute furry friend, body type, and so on. You're able to pick preset archetypes that fit into a variety of fighting builds. For example, one preset build focuses more on physical strength for close-range melee combat, while other classes may focus on psi powers, which is the game's equivalent of magic and spellcasting. Then of course, there is range weaponry presets which is best used for those who prefer going in with guns blazing. Here is where Biomutant suffers the most, its core gameplay systems. The developers had this ambitious idea of, hey, we know players really love Zelda Breath of the Wild and other franchises such as Witcher 3 and Mass Effect. Let's take inspiration from those titles and create our own unique universe and make it really fun and interesting to play in. Well, sadly, for Experiment 101, that didn't really end up boding too well. Biomutant has many different RPG systems that may sound really good and interesting on paper, but are actually horrible and poorly implemented. The game has a crafting system, upgrading system for gear and weapons. As you explore the world and kill enemies, you can find gear and weapon parts that you can either dismantle for parts or sell for leaps, the game's money currency. In the main menu, you have the option to mix and match whatever gear or weapon parts you want to create, loot that would fit your playstyle. You can craft a two-handed sword that has its own special set of attacks based on its weapon class, or go more for a dual-wielding one-handed build instead. Players can do the same thing with their gear pieces, such as legs, chest, head, and so on. Depending on the part you choose, you can create armor that's more geared towards radiation, flame, or cold that keeps your furry friend from getting hurt, depending on the environment. The problem with these systems is that player choice is meaningless, simply because the game is easy. I was playing the game on hard difficulty, and it took me about an hour or so to get used to the game's mechanics and controls and how the game was designed. At first, I was afraid that I might have picked the wrong build or that I'm not really being efficient with my choices, but as the hours went by, I realized that this game's core systems are poorly executed and might as well not even exist because they add absolutely nothing to the game's overall gameplay experience. The combat system is also poor. Not only is the combat system repetitive, it also feels weightless and most importantly delayed and unresponsive. I cannot explain how many times I've died to enemies because the unresponsiveness of the game's controls and delayed input lag. Biomutant's combat system is basic. It's based off combo systems like most hack and slash games, but also with addition to RPG elements such as weapon damage and the addition of being able to use ranged weapons. The game has dodge and parry mechanics as well. There have been countless times when I press the parry button and my character just sits there for at least a second or two before the animation plays out of him trying to parry an attack. If the parry misses, I am then proceeded to be bullied by a pack of mobs that start hitting me, and then it just chains into a stun lock and drains my health down to 0. There have also been plenty of cases when I try to dodge roll out of trouble, but the character is still frozen in place because my parry either failed originally or is still stuck in the animation from a previous hit from an enemy. I've played many games with unresponsive controls and have horrible input lag, but Biomutant is on a whole different level. This happened throughout almost every single encounter over the course of my 20 to 25 hour playtime on hard difficulty, and needless to say, it was not fun. We are in the year 2021. This type of coding and poor playtesting is absolutely unacceptable in this day and age. Exploring the world in Biomutant also feels bland and uninspiring. After about an hour or so, players finally get to explore and see what the world is made of, and sadly, the world of Biomutant feels lifeless. While the game is set in a post-apocalyptic setting, that doesn't mean that the world has to still feel lifeless. The world is riddled with the same looking environments and a small variety of enemies with copy-pasted animations and class types. There are also NPCs that you meet in the world that speak in a gibberish language and give you pointless quests that serve no interesting purpose when it comes to the game's lore or rewards. The only good reward in these quests are the experience points so you can level quicker and become more overpowered. As you explore different places, you will come across puzzles that require you to match white and yellow colors on different types of objects such as TVs, phone booths, and so on. Counting as collectibles, they are spread across the entire map of the game and are all exactly the same in principle and offer absolutely nothing unique in return. Assets are reused so frequently, the lack of variety really kills any immersion. For example, one of the side quests asked me to find 5 and solve 5 phone booth puzzles that are spread across the entire map, but another asked me to find and solve TV puzzles. The puzzle is exactly the same, but laid out in a different pattern, and you also have to solve them in less than 10 moves, which by the way is extremely easy, because all players have to do is match colors. Now, repeat this course of action over 50 times. Doesn't paint a real pretty picture, does it? Another side quest asks you to find 23 prisoners that are imprisoned in a cage. Once you free them, you have a choice to either kill them or save them. Killing them grants you dark points and saving them grants you light points. This game even went as far as adding evil and good choices to your character that don't really matter at the end of the day. The game has a mount system too. This is probably the only mechanic that is somewhat properly implemented and is quite useful in the game. You can acquire different mounts throughout your journey. They're easy to use and control and make traveling the world a lot faster and easier. The game also has a tribe mechanic where you can find tribes to befriend or fight against. During this review, I went with a purely dark path and joined the tribe that believes that the world can only be saved if there's only one tribe in power. In all honesty, I had little to no care for any of the tribes. Biomutant does a poor job of making the players care for any of the characters. I never felt bad for killing the prisoners that I had freed or the tribes that I've killed, simply because the lore is just too boring and not interesting. At first, I tried listening to the dialogue and see how I would feel, but the narrator's horrific and obnoxious manner of narration of all events really hampered the experience. Overall, Biomutant is a perfect example of what happens to a game when it's too ambitious. This issue in the game development is known as feature creep, where the designers and core development team all have these great ideas on paper for a game project, but instead of creating 1 or 2 ideas that are well executed, they decide to bite more than they can chew and end up hurting the game in the long run. The audio in Biomutant is nothing special. Throughout the entirety of my 24-hour playthrough, I've only heard 2 or 3 tracks that are constantly repeated based on where you are on the map. The music would also snap in and out of different tunes at weird times. As soon as my character walked into a building, a specific music track would start playing. As soon as I got close to the wall, however, the game assumed I was outside and started playing a different track. While it doesn't really detract from the gameplay portion of the experience, it still negatively impacts the immersion of the game. The character speaking gibberish at first was funny, but then it just became obnoxious and got old really quick. During the main questline, I could not take anything seriously due to how everything was being portrayed. The game was reviewed on the Xbox Series X. Biomutant played at a silky smooth 60 frames per second with HDR and looked quite decent. However, it's very clear that this game was originally developed for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One in mind. The visuals are not mind-blowing. There are also some very low poly and low res textured assets that are easily noticeable. Normally, low poly with low res textures are usually showcased from a far distance, but many of these assets here were seen up close and they looked very pixelated and ugly. The game also has a consistent level of detail issues and pop-ins which should not be acceptable for a system like the Xbox Series X. The game is not a looker by any means, but it probably tried not to be. Overall, the audio is not very good, the visuals are okay and are acceptable for when the game was being made at the time. However, if we are to judge this game based on 2020 standards or later, when it comes to visuals, then it's quite abysmal, and it looks like a high-end mobile game with many overly repeated assets. One particularly big issue I faced while playing was constantly being booted out to the main menu. No, not the Biomutant menu, the Xbox main menu. At a few points during my playthrough, I kept dying in a specific combat section due to aforementioned combat system issues. I would try to load a checkpoint, only to be thrown out into the user interface. This happened 4 to 6 times in the course of 10 minutes. This level of polish is absolutely unacceptable. Biomutant is an embarrassment, and is perhaps one of the worst games I've played in probably the last decade or so. It's a game that severely suffers from an identity crisis, and doesn't know what it wants to be. Is it an open world action game that resembles Witcher 3? Or is it a Zelda Breath of the Wild clone with an amazing sense of exploration? The answer? It's neither. It's just a mediocre game all around. There's nothing good about it. The combat system is weightless, repetitive with very unresponsive controls, which equals to be not fun. Exploring the world is also equally not fun. Everything just feels the same. If you've done something once, get ready to do it 1,000 times more, because that's exactly what this game is like. The game lacks a soul, which saps interest. It's also riddled with horrible, boring side quests and a ton of random and quite frequent crashes. The game is also $60, which makes this feel like a complete ripoff. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away as possible from this game. Also, be a good friend and tell your friends about this game and how they should not spend a single dime on it. Because if among the things that Experiment 101 did right was calling this game Biomutant. Because that's exactly what this game is. A biomutant that belongs in a dumpster full of toxic waste. Gaming Instincts gives Biomutant a final verdict of 3.5 out of 10. This has been Gaming Instincts' review of Biomutant. The original article can be found in the description below. If you want to see more reviews and videos like this, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching. This has been Sam Lee, and until next time.